Arthur skipped my wedding. I stood in the bridal suite, staring at my phone 10 minutes before my walk down the aisle. The text read, "Permit crisis. Good luck." Knowing your father views you as a minor inconvenience is a specific kind of poison. I didn't scream. So, what did I do when my $850 million eco-city empire caught his attention years later? Stick around. The payback was something he never saw coming. Drop your city and the time you're watching this if you've ever been the black sheep of your family. I never looked back. The silence in the bridal suite was suffocating. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the string quartet warming up down the long hallway. They were playing a classical piece that was supposed to sound joyful, but right then, it just felt incredibly hollow. I smoothed the heavy lace of my gown. My fingers were perfectly steady. I was 32 years old, a grown woman who had fought tooth and nail for every single scrap of professional dignity I possessed. Yet, one text message from Arthur had threatened to reduce me to an aching shell. I stared at myself in the tall mirror. I did not look like a bride whose heart had just been casually tossed aside. I looked remarkably calm. The heavy wooden door clicked open behind me. I did not turn around immediately. I expected it to be the wedding coordinator telling me it was time to line up. Instead, two strong hands wrapped gently around my waist, and the familiar, grounding scent of cedar and rain filled the stagnant air. It was David, my groom. He rested his chin lightly on my shoulder, looking at our shared reflection. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not give me a pitying look. He just saw the illuminated screen of the phone gripped in my hand, read the cold words from Arthur, and understood the entire tragic story without a single syllable being spoken. He kissed my temple. His voice was incredibly steady. He told me that we did not need people who did not want to be here. He reminded me that this day was about us, about the real family we were building together from scratch. Knowing something logically is one thing, but feeling the truth of it sink into your bones is another. I nodded slowly. I pried the phone from my fingers and placed it face down on the vanity. When the time finally came, I walked out of that room with my head held high and my shoulders squared. I stood at the altar, holding David's hands. The moment was objectively beautiful, but my eyes, betraying my own iron resolve, darted to the front row on the left side of the aisle. There was a heavy oak chair with a small, elegant gold-embossed placard. It read, "Father of the Bride." It was empty, a glaring, silent void that echoed much louder than the beautiful wedding march playing around us. Standing there, reciting my vows, a part of my soul finally snapped. It was not a violent explosion. It was a clean, surgical break. The girl who desperately wanted Arthur's approval died at that altar. I was finally free. 5 years passed. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, watching the morning sunlight wash over the Chicago skyline. My company, Terra Verde, was now an $850 million reality. We designed and built sustainable urban ecosystems. It was a world of breathable architecture, solar glass, and living green walls. It was the exact, deliberate opposite of Vanguard Estates. Arthur loved heavy mahogany, dark, windowless boardrooms, and suffocating concrete slabs. I loved transparency, natural light, and structures that actually breathed. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and turned away from the skyline. The main drafting floor buzzed with quiet, focused energy. My eyes settled on a desk near the center of the room. Mr. Henderson was sitting there, carefully adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed a complex topographic map. He was 70 years old. His hair was entirely white, his hands slightly weathered from decades in the field. He was, without question, the most brilliant master surveyor I had ever known. Vanguard Estates had thrown him away like garbage. Julian, in one of his typical arrogant cost-cutting phases, had fired Mr. Henderson just 2 weeks before his official pension kicked in. Julian claimed the company needed younger, more aggressive blood. He essentially robbed a loyal man of his retirement to pad a quarterly spreadsheet. The day it happened, I did not hesitate. I drove straight to Mr. Henderson's house and offered him a senior advisory role at Terra Verde with double his previous salary. He brought decades of flawless land data, unmatched expertise, and a fierce, quiet loyalty that money simply cannot buy. I watched him smile as a young junior architect asked for his advice. This was what real power looked like. I did not build my empire by shouting or stepping on the vulnerable. I built it in absolute silence. I did not give interviews. I did not flaunt my wealth on social media. I just acquired supply chains, secured exclusive eco-materials, and built a fortress brick by brick. Vanguard Estates was still operating on outdated brute force, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath them was shifting. They thought they were the apex predators of the real estate market. They had no idea they were already bleeding. My empire was hungry. The sleek monitor on my desk chimed softly. It was the morning financial broadcast. I sat down and unmuted the screen. A familiar, sharp logo flashed across the bottom ticker. Vanguard Estates. The camera cut to a live press conference. Julian was standing behind a podium, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that cost more than a decent car. He looked incredibly arrogant, soaking in the flashes of the cameras. He cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. He was officially announcing Vanguard's aggressive bid for the Riverfront project. It was a billion-dollar municipal initiative, easily the largest urban development contract in the city's modern history. I leaned closer to the monitor, resting my chin on my hands. Julian spoke smoothly about innovation. He threw around buzzwords like eco-friendly, sustainable living, and green integration. I smiled. It was a very cold, very genuine smile. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed the conceptual renderings of their proposed development. I recognized the slope of the sustainable retaining walls. I recognized the unique geometric pattern of the water filtration gardens. He was using my blueprints. He was standing in front of the entire city, staking his billion-dollar claim on the exact designs he had stolen from me 5 years ago. He thought he had won. He thought he had completely erased my existence from the narrative. But Arthur and Julian shared a fatal flaw. They were deeply, incurably arrogant. They only ever looked at the concrete profit margins. They never bothered to read the deep soil reports. They never looked at the historical chain of title for the specific acreage that anchored the entire riverfront zone. They assumed they could just bulldoze their way through the legalities like they always did. They did not know that the core of that land had a hidden, unbreakable lock. The city could not grant the final zoning permits without the signature of the primary title holder. Julian was selling a billion-dollar dream built on a plot of dirt he did not actually control. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching my brother bask in his stolen glory. He had just publicly committed Vanguard to a promise he legally could not keep. He took the bait. Growing up in Arthur's sprawling suburban estate was like living in a heavily guarded, beautifully curated museum. You were strictly forbidden from touching the expensive exhibits, and you were painfully aware that you were not considered one of them. The air inside that house perpetually smelled of imported leather furniture, stale cigar smoke, and a thick, unspoken tension that hung around your neck. Arthur ruled this environment not with loud shouting or physical rage, but with an icy, crushing indifference. He was a tyrant of total silence. If you did something that displeased him, he simply looked at you, He looked at you like you were a severely bad investment he was seriously considering liquidating before the market closed. Margaret was his willing and constant accomplice. She floated through the echoing hallways in her signature cashmere sweaters, constantly smoothing over his sharp, jagged edges with a barrage of pathetic excuses. Her entire existence revolved around keeping Arthur comfortable. She always told me to lower my voice. She always told me to step back and make room for Julian. Julian was the golden heir. He was exactly 3 years older than me, but in Arthur's eyes, he was a flawless deity. Where I was observant, precise, and deeply interested in structural engineering, Julian was loud, incredibly entitled, and entirely mediocre at everything he attempted. I vividly remember the day Julian barely passed his college entrance exams. He had scored abysmally low, scraping by with the absolute minimum requirement. Arthur was beaming. He handed Julian the keys to a brand new, gleaming silver Mercedes and strapped a solid gold Rolex onto his wrist. They celebrated in the grand dining room with expensive champagne. I was sitting down in the freezing, unfinished basement. I had been awake for 36 straight hours, carefully gluing together a complex scale model of a sustainable suspension bridge for a state-level architectural competition. My fingers were blistered. I won the first-place ribbon. When I brought it upstairs, hoping for just a nod of acknowledgement, Arthur did not even look up from his tablet. Margaret quickly shooed me away, whispering that I was ruining Julian's special moment. I realized then that merit meant absolutely nothing in this family. Bloodline and gender dictated your entire worth. I swallowed the bitterness. The memory that truly cemented my hatred happened on Thanksgiving, a year before my wedding. It was one of the rare occasions I bothered to sit at their heavily decorated mahogany table. I was 26, working punishing hours as a junior architect. I had spent 6 months secretly developing a massive, self-sustaining eco-grid for the neglected riverfront district. It was a masterpiece of modern urban planning. I made the terrible mistake of bringing the rolled-up blueprint to the table. I unrolled it over the linen tablecloth, my voice shaking slightly with genuine, foolish excitement. I explained how the green integration would double the property value while securing massive municipal tax grants. Arthur slowly set his silver fork down. The entire dining room went dead silent. He looked at my intricate drawings, then looked at me with a slow, deeply mocking smile. "Plants do not make money, Elena," he scoffed, his deep voice carrying across the room. "You honestly think a bunch of fancy rooftop gardens are going to replace real, hard concrete? Leave the heavy lifting to the men. Stick to decorating." Julian snickered loudly, swirling his wine. Margaret said nothing. She just stared at her plate. But here is the twisted psychology of growing up neglected. It is the good daughter trap. When the people who are supposed to love you reject you, you do not logically walk away. You try harder. You falsely believe that if you just create something undeniably brilliant, they will finally see your worth. You hand them your absolute best work on a silver platter, desperately hoping to purchase their basic affection. I left the blueprints on the table and went home, feeling entirely defeated. 3 months later, I opened a high-profile industry magazine. There was a full-page spread announcing Julian's massive promotion to vice president of Vanguard Estates. His winning proposal to the board of directors, the Riverfront Eco-Grid. He had literally taken my blueprint, erased my name, slapped his own signature on the bottom right corner, and claimed it as his visionary genius. When I stormed into the house and confronted Margaret, she pulled me into the hallway, her eyes darting nervously toward Arthur's office. "Do not make a fuss, Elena," she hissed, her fingers digging into my arm. Julian needed a big win to secure his position. It stays in the family. You understand how business works. I understood perfectly. I was not a daughter. I was just inventory. There was only one person in the Vanguard Empire who ever truly saw me. My grandfather, Wallace. He was the original architect who founded the company long before Arthur turned it into a soulless, profit-driven machine. Grandpa Wallace was a man of dirt and steel, a builder who respected the natural foundation of the earth. His study was the only warm room in that massive, echoing house. It perpetually smelled of rich pipe tobacco, aged parchment, and drafting graphite. When I was a little girl, I would sit quietly in the corner of his study for hours, watching his weathered hands glide across massive sheets of drafting paper. He never told me to be quiet. He never told me to go play with dolls. He taught me how to read a topographic map before I could even ride a bicycle. He passed away during my sophomore year of college. It was a quiet, agonizing loss that tore a massive hole in my universe. Arthur did not shed a single tear at the funeral. He was too busy networking with city councilmen near the open grave. Before Grandpa Wallace died, he asked Margaret to leave the hospital room. He pulled me close. His breathing was incredibly shallow, rattling in his chest. He reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a heavy, antique brass compass. The metal was worn smooth from decades of use. He pressed it into my palm and curled my fingers over it. He looked directly into my eyes with a piercing, desperate clarity. He told me that Arthur had lost his way. He told me that Vanguard was going to crumble from the inside because they had forgotten how to build on solid ground. Then he whispered a sentence that would echo in my mind for the next decade. He said that concrete can crack, but core values never do. He told me to keep the compass close, and to always trust my own true north. I kept that heavy brass compass on my desk through every late-night study session. I kept it in my pocket during my first grueling job interviews. It was my only tangible connection to a family member who actually believed I was worth something. I thought it was just a beautiful, sentimental keepsake. I thought it was merely a philosophical reminder to stay grounded in a corporate world obsessed with cheap shortcuts. I had absolutely no idea that he had left me something far more valuable than advice. I did not know that the old brass instrument was a literal key. It was a hidden weapon, the most glaring, painful artifact in my personal museum of neglect was my college graduation day. I had busted my back for 4 grueling years. I worked exhausting night shifts at a small, independent drafting firm just to pay for my own rent and tuition, studying until my eyes literally burned from staring at glowing screens. I graduated at the absolute top of my class with a specialized, advanced degree in environmental architecture. I harbored this foolish, lingering fantasy that standing on that stage with highest honors would finally force Arthur to see my true worth. I sent him the formal invitation 3 months in advance. I reminded Margaret twice. The day of the ceremony. The summer heat was absolutely scorching. I stood in my heavy black cap and gown, sweat trickling down my spine, scanning the packed stadium bleachers. I watched thousands of proud parents cheering, holding up colorful signs and bouquets of flowers. I waited until the entire crowd dispersed. I waited until the massive parking lot emptied out. They never came. I took the noisy, rattling city train back to the sprawling suburban estate, feeling humiliated and entirely foolish for hoping. When I walked up the long, paved driveway, I found it packed shoulder to shoulder with luxury cars. I walked through the heavy front doors, still wearing my graduation gown, clutching my hard-earned diploma in a stiff leather binder. I found a lavish, fully catered party in full swing on the back patio. Waiters were circulating with crystal glasses of expensive champagne and silver trays of caviar. Arthur was standing by the pool, giving a boisterous, laughing speech to Julian. He was toasting Julian's dedication to the firm. The most agonizing kicker was the truth behind the celebration. Julian had just lost a massive commercial zoning contract a week prior because he simply forgot to file the crucial environmental paperwork on time. His sheer negligence had literally cost Vanguard Estates over $500,000 in unrecoverable municipal fines. His punishment for gross incompetence was a catered party and a brand new corner office. I stood in the doorway, entirely invisible to the room. Margaret finally noticed me hovering in the entryway. She gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile and quickly looked away. I finally stopped waiting. I did not say a single word to anyone at the party. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not walk out to the patio and demand an explanation. I just turned around and walked up the grand, sweeping staircase to my childhood bedroom. I pulled 2 large suitcases from the back of the closet and opened them on the bed. I packed only the absolute essentials. I packed my drafting tools, my books, and the clothes I had purchased with my own money. Margaret had bought me a delicate gold necklace the year prior, purely to ensure I looked presentable for a society gala. I took it off and left it resting carefully on the center of the vanity mirror. I did not want a single ounce of their money holding me down. I zipped up the suitcases. The sound of the zippers felt incredibly loud in the quiet room. I picked up the antique brass compass from my nightstand, running my thumb over the smooth glass surface, and slipped it deeply into my coat pocket. I walked back down the stairs. The heavy rolling wheels of my luggage thumped rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Through the open French doors, I could still hear Arthur laughing loudly at one of Julian's terrible jokes. Neither of them even glanced toward the hallway. I pulled the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the humid evening air. I walked down the long, winding driveway. The faint sounds of clinking crystal and fake corporate laughter slowly faded away behind me, replaced by the quiet chirping of evening crickets. That was the exact moment the emotional fracture occurred. It was the same quiet, surgical break I would feel years later, standing at the altar in my wedding dress, staring at that empty chair. I realized that my father did not just ignore me. He actively wanted me to stay beneath him. He was deeply threatened by any talent he could not exert total control over. I walked toward the train station with a mind as clear and cold as winter ice. I swore to myself right then that I would build something magnificent. I would build an empire so incredibly massive and structurally flawless that it would inevitably cast a dark, inescapable shadow over his entire fragile life. I walked into the light. The early days of building Terra Verde were not glamorous. There were no sleek glass offices or million-dollar budgets. David and I rented a tiny, cramped room above a busy neighborhood bakery. The air always smelled heavily of burnt sugar and yeast. Our desks were cheap, folding plastic tables that wobbled every time an emergency siren wailed on the street below. But it was ours. It was a space entirely free of Arthur's suffocating judgment. David was a structural engineer with a brilliant, quiet mind. He was the exact opposite of the loud, arrogant men I had grown up around. When I laid out a radical blueprint for a self-sustaining municipal park, he did not scoff. He did not tell me to stick to decorating. He simply pulled up a chair, adjusted his glasses, and meticulously calculated the load-bearing requirements for my ambitious green roof structures. He listened to me. He respected my vision. We worked side by side under flickering fluorescent lights, eating cheap takeout boxes at 2 a.m. We started small. We bid on minor community center renovations and neglected neighborhood lots, while Vanguard Estates was busy bribing city officials for massive concrete high-rises. Terra Verde was quietly transforming the forgotten corners of the city into breathable, sustainable microecosystems. We delivered every single project under budget and 2 weeks ahead of schedule. We never issued press releases. We never threw lavish catered parties to celebrate our own mediocrity. We let the flawless quality of our work speak for itself. Slowly, the momentum began to shift. Progressive city planners started noticing our meticulous environmental impact reports. Independent investors, tired of Vanguard's aggressive, outdated bullying tactics, began seeking us out. Our tiny office above the bakery transformed into a mid-sized studio, and then, eventually, into the sweeping, sunlit corporate floor we occupy today. Through it all, David was my absolute sanctuary. Whenever the lingering trauma of my family threatened to make me doubt myself, he was there, grounding me with logic and unwavering support. We did not build our company on inherited wealth or stolen credit. We built it on absolute trust, mutual respect, and undeniable competence. We built it on rock. 5 years after I walked away, the Riverfront project finally went live. It was the absolute crown jewel of the city's urban development plan. Vanguard Estates desperately needed the contract. Arthur had over-leveraged the company on several massive, failing commercial strip malls. And Julian's chaotic management style had bled their cash reserves dangerously dry. To even qualify for the billion-dollar municipal bid, Vanguard had to present a flawless, environmentally sound proposal. To fund their aggressive lobbying efforts, Julian began cutting corners internally. He did not reduce his own extravagant executive bonuses. Instead, he targeted the senior, highly paid technical staff. He called Mr. Henderson into his glass-walled office on a random Tuesday morning. Mr. Henderson had given 35 years of his life to Vanguard Estates. He had mapped the bedrock of half the city. He was the only surveyor in the entire firm who truly understood the volatile soil composition near the river basin. Julian fired him without a single ounce of hesitation. He used cold, empty corporate jargon, claiming the firm needed agile restructuring and streamlined operations. He handed the 70-year-old man a cardboard box and gave him 1 hour to clear out his desk. The cruelty of the decision was heavily calculated. Julian terminated the contract exactly 14 days before Mr. Henderson's full, lifelong pension was legally guaranteed to kick in. By firing him just 2 weeks early, Vanguard saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement payouts. It was a sickening, mathematical betrayal. Mr. Henderson's wife had recently been diagnosed with a severe respiratory illness. That pension was supposed to secure her medical care. Julian knew this. He simply did not care. A loyal, brilliant man was instantly reduced to a discarded liability on a quarterly spreadsheet. The news rippled through the architectural community within hours. I was sitting at my desk when my lead project manager quietly informed me of the termination. I felt a familiar, icy rage blooming in my chest. Julian made a fatal error. It was pouring rain that afternoon. I did not send an assistant. I did not make a phone call. I drove my own car directly to the Vanguard Estates parking garage. I parked near the visitor entrance and waited, watching the heavy glass revolving doors. Within 20 minutes, I saw him. Mr. Henderson walked slowly out of the building, holding a damp cardboard box filled with framed photos and antique drafting rulers. 2 burly security guards were trailing closely behind him, aggressively ushering him off the corporate property as if he were a common criminal. I stepped out of my car and popped open a large black umbrella. The cold rain hit the pavement in sheets. I walked directly up to him. He looked up, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, his eyes carrying a deep, humiliating shame. He tried to force a polite smile. I did not offer him empty pity. I did not ask him how he was feeling. I looked at the security guards until they awkwardly backed away, intimidated by the sheer authority in my silence. I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. I told him that Vanguard did not deserve another second of his time. I opened the passenger door of my car and told him to get in. As the rain hammered against the roof of the vehicle, I handed him a formal employment contract I had drafted on the drive over. I offered him the position of Senior Director of Topography at Terra Verde. I offered him double his previous salary, comprehensive premium health care for his wife, and the absolute, unwavering respect he had earned over 3 decades of flawless work. He stared at the crisp white paper. His hands began to tremble. He took off his fogged glasses and wept quietly in the passenger seat. What Julian failed to understand is that true loyalty is not something you demand with a paycheck. It is something you earn by protecting your people. When Mr. Henderson finally looked up, he told me something incredible. He had taken his personal, unedited soil reports with him. He knew exactly why Vanguard's riverfront proposal was structurally doomed. I secured my strongest ally. Terra Verde did not just grow, it evolved into a quiet apex predator in the architectural ecosystem. I did not care about glossy magazine covers, industry awards, or elite society galas. While Julian spent Vanguard's dwindling cash reserves on lavish public relations campaigns and expensive dinners with city councilmen, I was systematically buying the actual earth beneath their feet. Sustainable architecture is not just about drawing pretty green vines on a blueprint to appease a committee. It requires very specific, highly engineered materials. You need specialized solar reactive glass, permeable concrete that actively filters rainwater, and reinforced timber that meets strict municipal environmental standards. There were only 3 major suppliers in the greater Midwest capable of producing these exact materials at the massive scale required for a billion-dollar municipal contract like the Riverfront project. Over the course of 18 months, Terra Verde quietly acquired controlling shares in all 3 of those manufacturing facilities. We did not change the corporate logos on their delivery trucks. We did not announce our aggressive acquisitions to the financial press. We simply restructured their internal operational priorities through closed-door board meetings. Terra Verde's internal projects were given absolute, unquestioned priority. External corporate buyers, especially those with a documented history of environmental violations, were placed on an indefinite wait list or subjected to a 300% premium markup. Julian was completely oblivious to the shifting landscape. He was busy printing expensive brochures featuring my stolen designs, promising the city council a sustainable utopia. He never bothered to check if he could actually source the physical materials to build it. He blindly assumed his inherited position as vice president of Vanguard Estates meant the global supply chain would automatically bow to his demands. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson and David worked seamlessly together in our sunlit drafting room. Mr. Henderson's flawless, highly detailed topographic maps allowed David to calculate complex structural loads with mathematical perfection. We were a well-oiled machine operating without a single wasted movement. Every municipal contract we signed, every independent supplier we quietly acquired, was another invisible, reinforced brick in the wall I was building around my family's crumbling empire. They thought I was just a bitter, overly emotional girl who ran away from home because her feelings were hurt. They had absolutely no idea I was systematically cutting off their corporate oxygen supply. Arthur built his entire legacy on brute force and intimidation. I was building mine on leverage, precision, and absolute control. The trap was now fully set and carefully concealed beneath the surface. I just had to wait for them to take the final step. I watched the clock. The inevitable collapse began on a quiet Tuesday morning. The city's Municipal Oversight Committee finally launched a full, public investigation into Vanguard Estates. Julian's chaotic management style had finally caught up with him. In a desperate attempt to secure the preliminary zoning permits for the riverfront project, Julian had actively bribed two mid-level environmental officials to falsify the initial soil safety reports. He wanted to pave over a protected wetland area to save time and concrete costs. It was a massive, unforgivable violation of federal environmental law. The news broke on the financial networks before noon. Vanguard's stock price immediately plummeted. They were standing on the absolute brink of corporate bankruptcy and a severe criminal indictment. My private office phone rang at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The caller ID displayed a private number, but I recognized the heavy, rhythmic breathing on the other end the second I picked up the receiver. It was Arthur. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing after 5 years of total silence. He did not offer a single syllable of apology for missing my wedding or allowing my brother to steal my intellectual property. He simply barked orders, his deep voice dripping with the same icy arrogance that had defined my entire childhood. He told me that Vanguard was facing a minor bureaucratic misunderstanding. He demanded that I immediately transfer Terra Verde's pristine environmental certifications and our exclusive material supply contracts over to Vanguard's legal name. He framed it not as a request, but as my fundamental duty as his daughter. He actually had the sheer audacity to tell me that it was time to stop playing with my little startup and come home to help the real family business. He believed that my entire $850 million empire was merely a convenient backup fund for his own catastrophic failures. Listening to him speak, I did not feel anger. I did not feel the familiar, suffocating panic of my youth. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical fascination. I was observing a man who genuinely believed he could dictate the laws of gravity just because he was used to people falling at his feet. He told me he would send his lawyers to my office the next morning with the transfer paperwork. I let him finish his arrogant monologue. I let the silence stretch between us. The line went dead. I did not wait for his lawyers to arrive at my office. I scheduled a brief, 15-minute meeting at a neutral, upscale coffee shop located exactly halfway between the Terra Verde headquarters and the Vanguard Tower. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. Arthur was already sitting at a corner table. He looked visibly aged, the dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion, but he was still desperately clinging to his aura of absolute authority. He slid a thick manila folder across the smooth wooden table the moment I sat down. It contained the transfer agreements. If I signed those papers, Terra Verde would effectively become a subsidiary organ of Vanguard Estates, bleeding my clean resources to resuscitate his dying legacy. I did not even open the folder. I looked directly into his eyes, my expression entirely neutral. I pushed the folder slowly back across the table. I told him, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Terra Verde was not a charity for failing developers. Arthur's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into the harsh, threatening register he used to terrorize his employees. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He threatened to use his remaining political connections to tie my company up in endless, suffocating litigation. He promised to blackball my name in every architectural firm in the state. I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. The man who had once seemed like an immovable mountain was now just a desperate executive watching his empire crumble. He tried to invoke my mother's name, claiming Margaret was entirely heartbroken over my stubborn defiance. It was a cheap, manipulative tactic. I knew Margaret only cared about maintaining her country club memberships. which were currently being funded by the very company Arthur was destroying. I simply smiled. It was a small, polite, entirely empty smile. I stood up from the table, adjusted my coat, and looked down at him. I told him that intimidation only works when the other person actually has something to lose. Would you help your toxic family if they only came to you when they needed money? Let me know in the comments if this resonates. I left him behind. Returning to my office, I felt a strange, electric anticipation humming in my veins. Arthur's desperate threats had inadvertently triggered the final phase of my plan. I walked over to the secure glass display cabinet in the corner of my office. Sitting on a velvet cushion was the heavy, antique brass compass that Grandpa Wallace had given me on his deathbed. I took it out, feeling the cool, familiar weight of the metal in my palm. Concrete can crack, but core values never do. Trust your true north. I sat at my desk and carefully examined the instrument. I had always assumed the compass was purely symbolic, a sweet token of affection from an old man. But a few months ago, while having the brass professionally cleaned, the jeweler had noticed a microscopic seam along the bottom casing. I pressed my thumbs against the hidden latch and twisted sharply. The bottom of the compass clicked and unscrewed, revealing a shallow, hollow compartment. Inside lay a tightly folded piece of aged parchment. My fingers were perfectly steady as I unfolded it. It was a highly classified routing number and a corresponding alphanumeric access key for a private security box at a sovereign bank in Zurich, Switzerland. Grandpa Wallace had not just left me philosophical advice. He had left me a literal, physical key to his actual legacy. I immediately called David into the office. I showed him the parchment. We did not hesitate. Within 4 hours, we had boarded a private transatlantic flight. The entire journey. I stared out the window at the dark ocean below, analyzing the pieces of the puzzle. Grandpa Wallace knew Arthur was fundamentally corrupt. He knew Vanguard would eventually eat itself alive under Arthur and Julian's toxic leadership. He had prepared a fail-safe, a hidden mechanism designed to bypass the traditional lines of corporate succession. We landed in Zurich just as the sun was rising over the Alps. We walked into the sterile, heavily guarded vault of the bank. The bank manager verified my identity and the access key. He left us alone in a quiet, windowless viewing room. Sitting on the steel table was a single, sealed titanium lockbox. I reached out and opened the heavy lid. The truth was inside. The lockbox contained a stack of perfectly preserved legal documents, stamped with the embossed seal of a premier international law firm. It was an irrevocable trust. In the complex world of high-stakes corporate finance and real estate, an irrevocable trust is the absolute ultimate fortress. Once it is legally established and signed, it cannot be altered, amended, or dissolved by anyone, not even the person who created it. It entirely removes the specified assets from the creator's taxable estate and places them under the strict, untouchable control of an independent trustee. Grandpa Wallace had secretly executed this trust exactly 3 weeks before his death. He did not place cash or stock options inside it. He placed the original deed to the core acreage of the riverfront district. Arthur and Julian had spent the last 5 years aggressively lobbying for the billion-dollar municipal development rights, completely unaware that Vanguard Estates did not actually own the foundational bedrock of the project. But Grandpa Wallace was a man of strict environmental principles. He did not simply hand the land over to me. He attached a rigid, unbreakable conditional clause to the trust. The deed would only legally transfer to a direct heir who successfully passed a Class A environmental audit, proving their independent architectural firm operated with zero carbon footprint and pristine ecological compliance. It was a test of character, written in legal ink. Julian, With his falsified soil reports, massive federal violations, and history of gross negligence, had catastrophically failed the baseline requirements of the trust. His actions had permanently disqualified him from inheritance. Vanguard Estates was legally locked out of its own flagship project. I sat in that quiet Swiss vault, reading the flawless legal architecture of my grandfather's final masterstroke. Terra Verde, with its spotless environmental record and self-sustaining ecosystem models, was the only entity on Earth that met the stringent requirements. Grandpa Wallace had engineered a legal mechanism that ensured the land could never be exploited by greedy, incompetent men. He used the strictest, most unforgiving paperwork in the financial world to protect the environment and hand the keys to the one person who actually respected it. No amount of screaming or corporate bullying could change the signatures on these pages. Justice was written down. We flew back to Chicago with the original, notarized trust documents securely locked in an encrypted briefcase. The moment I stepped off the plane, the final pieces of the board were locked into place. I did not go home to rest. I went straight to the Terra Verde headquarters and convened an emergency, closed-door meeting in our main conference room. Sitting at the long glass table were David, Mr. Henderson, and my elite team of corporate litigators. They were a group of incredibly sharp, methodical lawyers who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and strict trust enforcement. I laid the Swiss documents on the table alongside the massive, meticulously organized binder of evidence we had compiled over the last 5 years. The binder contained every single one of Mr. Henderson's original, unedited soil reports. It contained the exact timestamps of Julian's falsified municipal filings. It contained the financial records proving Terra Verde now controlled the absolute entirety of Vanguard's essential supply chain. I watched my lead attorney trace his finger over the irrevocable trust. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He looked up and confirmed what I already knew: Vanguard's entire billion-dollar proposal was built on a legal fiction. We spent the next 6 hours drafting the final execution orders. There was no shouting in the room. There were no emotional outbursts or dramatic speeches. It was a surgical, deeply analytical process. We were preparing a corporate guillotine, and we were making absolutely sure the blade was perfectly aligned. I looked over at Mr. Henderson. The older man was carefully reviewing the topographical overlays, ensuring there were no geographical loopholes Vanguard could exploit. He looked dignified, respected, and entirely focused. He was no longer a discarded victim. He was the master architect of their impending downfall. We finalized the paperwork just as the city streetlights flickered on outside the office windows. I placed the documents into a sleek black leather portfolio. Arthur had demanded that I come home and surrender my empire. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. I was going to show up at his doorstep. If you love seeing arrogant people humbled by strict legal paperwork, stick around for this boardroom showdown. The weapon was loaded. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Estates headquarters slid open. I walked into the grand marble lobby. I was not alone. David walked firmly by my right side. Mr. Henderson walked to my left, holding a thick leather briefcase. Behind us were 3 of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the city. We did not stop at the reception desk. We did not wait for an invitation. I knew the layout of this building better than I knew my own childhood home. We took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. The doors parted with a soft chime. The air on the executive level was incredibly stagnant, smelling heavily of bitter coffee and nervous sweat. We walked straight down the long, carpeted corridor toward the main boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors were slightly ajar. I pushed them open. Arthur and Julian were sitting at the far end of the massive conference table. They looked entirely exhausted. Their ties were loosened, their dress shirts wrinkled. The table was covered in messy stacks of emergency loan applications and frantic legal memorandums. They were desperately trying to secure private funding to pay off the impending municipal fines before the federal investigators officially seized their corporate accounts. When they heard our footsteps, they both looked up. Arthur's bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. For a brief, confusing second, relief flashed across his face. He genuinely thought I had come to surrender. He thought the cavalry had finally arrived to bail out his sinking ship. Julian let out a loud, arrogant sigh, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. He arrogantly told me it was about time I showed up, complaining that they had been waiting all weekend for my transfer signatures. I did not apologize for the intrusion. I did not sit down. My lawyers immediately fanned out across the room, taking positions around the table like highly trained sentinels. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, placing his heavy leather briefcase directly onto the polished mahogany surface. The metallic click of the latches echoed sharply in the quiet room. Arthur's eyes darted from the lawyers to Mr. Henderson. His expression shifted from arrogant relief to deep, sudden confusion. He demanded to know what a fired surveyor was doing back in his building. I looked down at my father. I told him that Mr. Henderson was not a fired surveyor. He was the senior director of topography at Terra Verde. The room grew cold. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured precision of an auditor delivering a final financial assessment. I told Julian that we had reviewed his municipal filings for the riverfront project. I told him we had noticed several glaring, impossible discrepancies in the environmental data. Julian's face went completely pale. He immediately became defensive. He raised his voice, sputtering that the project was none of my business. He claimed his internal team had thoroughly vetted every single inch of the river basin. I did not argue with him. I simply nodded at Mr. Henderson. The older man opened his briefcase. He did not look intimidated. He looked at Julian with the quiet, dignified pity of a true professional observing a foolish amateur. Mr. Henderson pulled out a thick stack of printed documents and slid them across the long table. They stopped right in front of Julian's hands. I told Julian to read them. They were Mr. Henderson's original, unedited soil composition reports. They were the exact, highly accurate topographic maps Julian had desperately tried to bury when he fired the man. The documents conclusively proved that the foundational bedrock near the river was completely unsuitable for Vanguard's heavy concrete high-rises. I kept my voice entirely flat. I explained that building their proposed structures on that unstable soil without proper green integration would inevitably cause a catastrophic structural collapse within a decade. I pointed to the highlighted sections of the documents. I noted that Julian had knowingly submitted falsified, forged reports to the Federal Environmental Commission to bypass the safety regulations. Arthur stared at the documents, his jaw tightening. He finally realized the absolute magnitude of his son's gross negligence. Julian was not just losing a contract, he was actively committing federal fraud. Julian began to stammer, his arrogant facade crumbling in real time. He tried to claim the paperwork was fake. He tried to blame the discrepancies on a clerical error in the junior drafting department. I let him drown in his own pathetic excuses. I did not interrupt him. I just watched him panic. He sounded exactly like a terrified child who had just been caught breaking an expensive vase in the museum. But this was not a minor mistake. This was a billion-dollar crime, and the evidence was sitting right on the table in black and white. He was completely trapped. The collapse of Vanguard Estates did not happen in a fiery, dramatic explosion, but rather with a quiet, inevitable surrender to gravity, exactly the way a rotten foundation gives way. Beginning the morning, the Municipal Oversight Committee officially released their damning findings to the public. splashing the falsified soil reports across the front page of every major financial newspaper in the city, and leading to Julian being escorted away by federal agents in a designer tracksuit, looking incredibly small and utterly terrified as he faced multiple counts of federal environmental fraud and corporate embezzlement, a colossal, unprecedented problem that Arthur's checkbook could no longer magically erase, crushed beneath the sheer, unyielding weight of the irrevocable trust and the irrefutable evidence of his golden heir's crimes. Arthur's tyrannical spirit was completely broken, prompting him to quietly resign as CEO by the end of the week and immediately plunging the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy without its flagship billion-dollar project, which perfectly positioned Terra Verde as the exclusive controller of the supply chains and primary environmental rights to swoop in and acquire the entire holding company for absolute pennies on the dollar at a private auction 6 months later. I did not purchase my father's fallen empire to gloat or to frame the acquisition papers as a trophy of ultimate revenge, but simply because the city desperately needed the land to be healed, and I was the only architect equipped to untangle the massive financial mess and do the job properly, systematically dissolving Arthur's dark, suffocating legacy into the clean, efficient machinery of my own company and slating the museum of my childhood trauma for immediate demolition. However, knowing that revenge, while highly effective as a motivator, is a terrible foundation for a permanent life that ultimately leaves you standing alone in a massive pile of rubble. I chose not to leave behind a legacy of destruction. Instead, I directed my demolition crew to completely gut the depressing, windowless monument to Arthur's massive ego, replacing the dark mahogany and heavy marble with self-tinting solar windows and living green walls that actively filtered the urban air, thereby transforming the building into the Wallace Eco-Architecture Academy. This fully funded, tuition-free institution was dedicated to teaching sustainable design to brilliant, underprivileged youths, creating a sanctuary for kids with raw talent who lacked the arrogant, inherited privileges that Julian had relied on. And as I stood quietly in the back row during the grand opening, holding David's hand and watching Mr. Henderson, now the honorary director of typography, cut the green ribbon, I realized the true power of weaponizing Arthur's intimidating wealth into an instrument of absolute grace to build a better, cleaner world. The final loose thread was Margaret, who, facing foreclosure and stripped of her cashmere and country club lunches after Arthur's accounts were frozen, reached out in tears to play the helpless victim and beg for a place in one of my guest properties, prompting me to hand her a meticulously drafted living trust that provided a comfortable stipend for necessities, but strictly required her to file for a permanent separation from Arthur and attend weekly psychological therapy to address her decades of severe enabling behavior. When she accused me of being as cold and controlling as my father, I calmly explained that while Arthur used his money to keep her small, silent, and compliant, I was using mine to force her to finally stand on her own 2 feet. Officially resigning from my lifelong role as her emotional collateral damaged a reality check that led her to sign the paperwork immediately before the 48-hour deadline expired. All of this turbulence finally gave way to a deeply rooted peace on a crisp, quiet Sunday morning in late autumn, as I sat at the large oak dining table in my own home, sunlight streaming through massive glass windows, sipping jasmine tea and watching David quietly sketch a new structural joint for the riverfront project, which Terra Verde was breaking ground on the following week to create the most advanced, environmentally sustainable urban district in the country. Thinking back to the freezing girl blistering her fingers on a model bridge and the heartbroken bride staring at a cruel text message, I understood the absolute truth that you cannot force a blind man to admire a beautiful blueprint, Nor can you force a toxic family to value your inherent worth. Legacy is not what people force you to inherit, but what you are brave enough to rebuild from the ruins. And looking down at the new municipal design surrounded by light, glass, and solid ground, I knew there were no more empty chairs waiting to break my heart, because I had finally, truly found home.